Today, though, we're mainly here this morning to hear Heather Booth talking about appeal characteristics with genres. I think that's going to be really exciting, as Heather is very, very experienced, um, and is one of the many amazing librarians from the Chicago area. This is a big thanks to Becky Spratford, who some of you might have heard of already, who recommended that we contact Heather to talk to us today. Um, so I'll hand it. Let's ask if everybody could first, though, please, other than Heather, mute your microphones so that that's not coming through at all. And if you could hold your questions till after Heather talks, because if you could, we'll need to put the questions through chat, and when Becky has things in screen share, she won't be able to see your questions coming through. So please hang on to your questions until after Becky has spoken. And now I will hand over to, sorry, I called Heather Becky. My apologies. Now I'll hand over to Heather, and really looking forward to hearing about this. Now, actually, we've just got to, we might just have to do a minor reconfiguration of the room here. But Heather, could you do a screen share first so we can see if we can actually see it? Perfect. Great.
Okay, can you hear me?
Could you speak up a little bit louder, please?
Yeah, is this better?
Yes.
Okay. I'm using a headset because I thought that would be a little bit better for the sound, but if this is bad, I can unplug it and just use the microphone on the computer. All right. So are we ready to get going? We're ready to start?
Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Here we go. All right. So thank you all so much for coming today. It sounds like some of you have come from quite some distance. I want to talk about the conversation, the big conversation, the Reader's Advisory conversation, and the way we use appeal elements, which if you look at the chat logs, some folks were discussing books that we've recently read, and there are some wonderful appeal terms being used in those descriptions that people were just sharing. So that's you guys are already experts, it seems, so that's fantastic. This is me. I am the audio editor at Booklist magazine, which is the book review journal of the American Library Association. I'm also the author of Serving Teens Through Reader's Advisory and the editor and author of the Whole Library Handbook, Teen Services, along with Karen Jensen, who runs the Teen Librarian Toolbox. So a lot of my background is working with teenagers. I understand lots of you may also work with a wide range of ages. So throughout my tenure as a librarian, I have worked with teenagers, but in the context of an adult services department, almost exclusively. So I've worked with everyone from, 4th or 5th grade, 9, 10, 11-year-olds, all the way up through adults in a reader's advisory setting. Oh, I'd like to begin just quickly while I'm talking, and don't feel bad about writing down things while I'm chatting, but imagine I have just arrived at your library and I have come up to you at the desk and I tell you I'm looking for a good book. I'd like you to jot down a few notes about a book that you've recently read and that you've enjoyed. This is something that happens to us all the time, every day. It's a little bit off-putting, which is why I wanted to start out with this a bit of a surprise pop quiz kind of thing. We never know when this request is going to come. Sometimes we're just sitting there waiting and it's a perfect scenario. Sometimes it comes when we are in the middle of answering another question or thinking about a project that we're working on outside of a reader's advisory context. And so we really have to shift gears and move back into this reader's advisory space at a moment's notice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about ways to make this more comfortable as we go on. So once you're done with that, you can just set it aside. We'll come back to it in a little while we talk about the conversation. We hear about readers advisory interviews, reference interviews. This is the phrase that's used all the time when we're in library school. This is the phrase that I was taught. We have a readers advisory or reference interview. I'd like for us to start thinking about this as a conversation, much more than an interview, for a few reasons. We all know that people already come into our libraries or don't come into our libraries carrying their own history of interaction with the library. We are an institution, and that can be intimidating to some people. We're sitting behind a desk, which can be intimidating to some people. We may appear to be more educated or have a background that is not as relatable to all of our patrons. And so I'd really like for us to think about ways to reduce the anxiety that people approach the desk with, because it's going to lead to more interactions and getting more books in more people's hands. And I think one way is to talk about this as a conversation, not as an interview. It's going to reduce the stigma and the expectations surrounding a phrase like interview. It's less intimidating. It's informal. We have conversations with our friends and our colleagues, and that's what we want. That's the kind of relationship that we want to have with our patrons. And it's easy then, too, if we're having a conversation, for when that person walks in to say, I'm looking for a good book, for you as the person behind the desk, as the reader's advisor, to pause and say, oh, wow, what a great question. And the conversation begins, as opposed to needing to have an answer that you produce right at that moment. But we can always respond, while we're thinking, with the great Joyce Sarix's favorite phrase, tell me about a book you've read and enjoyed. So this is a lovely phrase. Joyce has been a mentor of mine for many years, and she is the author of genre fiction in the public library, as well as Reader's Advisory Service in the public library. She's a fantastic librarian and a brilliant thinker on the topics of Reader's Advisory. So this is a phrase that she uses all the time. Tell me about a book you've read and enjoyed. It's really useful because it cuts through that, well, this is the last book that I read, but I didn't really like it. Or my sister told me I should read this book, and so I did. It's not really about that. It's not about what you recently read or what you know of. Tell me what you enjoyed. What was that experience like? What was enjoyable about it? How did that make you feel? If you ask this question and you don't get very far, which often I feel happens with teenagers, the phrase that I like to use is the opposite, in fact, which is, have you read a book recently that you really hated? This, especially I think with younger folks and folks who might in general be intimidated with dealing with a librarian, it acknowledges it's okay to dislike a book, and it tells them that we understand that not every book is right for every person. So, and especially if you know teenagers, asking them to talk at length about something they disliked often gets a very emotional, impassioned response, where if you're asking about what they've liked, you might get something that's a little bit more lukewarm. So once we get them talking, it's time to really sit back and listen. We're going to listen for all of the clues that they're giving us with the words that they're saying, as well as their body language. We're going to really pay attention to how they describe the book. And remembering that this is a conversation, it's okay to ask follow-up questions. And all this is fantastic if they've come to the desk and they've asked us for a recommendation, but that's not always how it happens. Sometimes what happens is we need to probe a little bit more. We need to inquire, we need to observe our patrons a little bit more. We can not do this, you don't want to get in their faces quite like that, but we can look for signals. We can look for people who are lingering in the stacks, people who are kind of browsing our displays. Maybe they're walking back and forth in front of the desk. Maybe they're smiling at us, just kind of waiting to open that conversation, waiting for us to begin to ask them if they need help, if we can offer anything or any kind of assistance. We should give signals that it's okay to ask us about books, and we should remember that it's our job to ask them if they need any help and get up behind the desk put put a staff picks display together so that they know that the people at the desk, the people in the library, are also people who like to recommend books. You can put little cards in the stacks, little shelf talkers that describe what what your favorite book is, your mystery picks from the department, things like that. And then we're going to do some active listening. We're going to really pay attention to their body language and tone. Do they open up? Do they start gesticulating with their hands as they're talking about how wonderful the scenery was? Can they picture it with, are they using their body language to show this expression? Are they confident about how they are describing the book? Are they tentative? Are they describing a book that was new, a new type of book to them, and it's a new experience to enjoy a book like that? All of these things are going to give us information that's going to help us find a great book for them and really make a good match. But as we're paying attention, we need to pay attention, and I really encourage you to try to be present in that moment. The little link that I have here, you can go back and click on it if you'd like after the fact, but there's, I'm not sure how well this resonates. I like using this with American audiences. I'm not sure if this is something that has traveled to you, but it's, oh, can you hear me? Okay.
And he said it's very, she does the music, he does all the
So the
Thanks for that, Louis. That's all right.
Someone, could everyone other than Heather please check that you are muted? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the American TV show Saturday Night Live had a character a number of years ago named Stefan, who was the culture reporter for New York City. And anytime a person would ask a question, can you recommend a great place for me to take my mother for Mother's Day, he plowed directly to the hottest spots that he knew about, and he was a caricature of a person who would talk at length about how much he knew, regardless of what the question was. So we want to avoid doing something like that and plowing right through with our favorite books and really listen to what they're asking for and being sure that we're responding not with the last great book we read, but something that really suits their needs and their interest. So take a moment, pause before you answer, really integrate what they've said and try to maybe repeat what they've said and add something else to it. So you might say something like, so it sounds like you're looking for a book to take on vacation with you. How do you feel about mysteries? Or I understand that last romance that you read was a no-go for you. Would you like something that was maybe a little bit more historical? And then they can correct you and say, oh no, I did like that romance. I just didn't like how it ended or something like that. And be sure that you're on the same page with that. I had an experience as a patron once where I was looking for a book to take on a vacation, and I asked the librarian for something that was light, but I really didn't want a romance, and she gave me a pile of romances. It was like that was the word she clicked on, and then she didn't check back in with me. This happens to all of us, but it's just a good idea to pause periodically and say, am I on the right track? Or does this one sound better than this one? In which direction should we head? So at this point, we know we're having a conversation. We're getting information from our patron about what they're looking for. Now is the time to start really thinking about appeal elements. Appeal gets to why we like the things that we like. We all like things that we just like. If you have a favorite color, if you have a favorite, some people have a favorite number. There are things that we like that are just part of who we are, and we haven't given a lot of thought to why we like them. Appeal gets to a little bit of that. And appeal is more than just the reading experience. Appeal is part of a larger cultural surrounding in our reading practice, in our reading history, and in who we are. So you have to think about what is it that you like that you've been exposed to. Maybe you're a mystery reader because your mother was a mystery reader, and there were lots of mysteries in the house where you grew up that you had access to and that you read extensively. Maybe you don't know that you would also like reading historical fiction because that was not the genre that you had access to. What is your personality right now? What are you drawn to in other parts of your life? Are you drawn to inspirational, uplifting kinds of stories? Are you drawn to things that examine the darker nature of humanity? Things like that all inform our taste and our appeal, and they're not exclusive to what we read. They're a part of the world around us. So how do we help people find the books that they want when there are so many to choose from, so many things so many different options? Appeal and categorizing things is going to help. So if you've used a service like Spotify for listening to music, or Netflix, or any of the Amazon products, you're seeing all kinds of algorithms at work. And if we were machines, that would be great. Algorithms would be all we would need in order to find the things that we wanted. But they're not flawless, and this is why it's so important for us as readers advisors to be very thoughtful about how we categorize books and how we listen to patrons and move them from one book or topic to the next. There is a great article, the book that I linked. Oh, it's here at the bottom. This one, You May Also Like Taste in an Age of Endless Choice, talks about some places where the algorithms just don't work. For example, in Netflix, Napoleon Dynamite is a really quirky kind of cult movie that really throws the algorithms. If somebody says that they've liked Napoleon Dynamite, oftentimes the algorithm doesn't really know what to direct you to next. And so it's kind of a red herring in terms of appeal. Similarly, a movie like The Shawshank Redemption is liked so widely by so many different people that it's almost a useless like. If you like The Shawshank Redemption, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like other Prison Break movies. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to like other movies based on books by Stephen King. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to like other movies set in the 1930s or 20s and 30s. So it really is something that throws the system. In the Spotify offices, the book tells the story of how Coldplay is banned. They do not allow listening to Coldplay anywhere but your headphones in the Spotify offices because Coldplay is such a polarizing band for that group of people. People either love them or they hate them. There's very little in between. There's very little ambiguity about how people felt about Coldplay in the office. And so it's one of those things where there's lots of exposure. You may love it, you may hate it, but it's hard to find common ground. We can think, too, in terms of appeal about how does reading interact with our social life. What kinds of things are we seeking out in pop culture? What is popular in the world around us? What are our friends reading? Are we in a book group? Is it important for us to read this book because it's about a topic or related to an author that is important in our group, defining our group identity? Fandom fits into this if you're talking about people who are so excited about the Avengers movie or Game of Thrones or things like that. Is that skewing what we would typically be reading into one direction or another? So what this means is it's really important to understand the reader's context. The book that Britney Spears is holding here is a kind of off-the-wall, I think it was a self-published title that became hugely popular because she posted a picture of herself reading it. So suddenly Plastic Tulips was everywhere for a brief time. Right now, The Hunchback of Notre Dame by Victor Hugo is one of the, it soared in popularity, not because that era of literature is making a comeback or people are especially interested in reading the classics, but because of the awful fire that happened. So it's important to think about what's happening in the world around the reader and what is drawing them to that book. So if they read The Hunchback, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to have another classic. Maybe they want to read something else that has a really lush description of Paris scenery. It's important to figure out what is it that has drawn them to that. So we need to learn about the reader as well as the books. It's easy to learn about the books. They're always sitting right there, but the person in front of us is the most important thing there. We need to work on building the relationships with our patrons, even if it's a very brief encounter, if it's not a regular that's coming back to our library again and again. We're trying to build a little relationship with them while they're in front of us. So I mentioned Joyce Sarix before. She is one of the people who has helped to sort the books into categories, like Tom Vanderbilt talks about how important that is in finding things that we like. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both Joyce and Nancy Pearl, who is another fantastic librarian from the Seattle, Washington area. She has written a few books about Reader's Advisory, and she also was behind the first One Book, One City initiative. So she has a different set of systems for talking about appeal, but they're related. So appeal gets to how the book feels. What is the reading experience of the book like? Is it a fast-paced book? Is it slow? What is the characterization like? What's the storyline like? Is the storyline prominent? Does it matter what the story itself is? Or is it more about the experience of being with the characters? Or is it more about the tone of the book and just having this brooding environment that we're reading through? Language and style are huge in appeal, especially if you're working with emerging readers who are still acquiring language and reading skills. It's really important to think about what kind of language and how the density of the text and what's going to be comfortable and enjoyable for them as readers. So you can ask a lot of different questions that they're kind of outside of the book itself that are going to help inform the kinds of appeals that the patron might be looking for. So if you ask questions about, well, what kind of characters do you like reading about, and they're not able to answer that question, or they're kind of stumped by that, you can get around specific questions by asking other questions like this. Where do you usually read? I live in a community where a lot of people, a great number of people, commute by train. So is this a train book? Are you going to be reading on the train into the city on your way to work? Do you usually read when you're sitting in your car waiting for your kids to finish baseball practice? What are your friends reading? That's great for figuring out if you're heading in the direction of book club picks in particular. Asking if they're in the mood for something. I tend to avoid asking teenagers if they're in the mood for something specific, just because of where teenagers are in their lives. The mood is so changeable. But for adults seeking a book out in the library, asking, are you in the mood for anything in particular, tends to be a pretty useful question. Thinking about what their life is like at this moment. Do you have the time or the energy for something really meaty? Or is this a week where something that's lighter and is going to be kind of escapist is going to be a better and more satisfying book for you? Also, in particular with people who are unaccustomed to asking librarians and library staff for suggestions about books, getting outside of books entirely and asking about what kinds of movies or music or video games do you like? When I first started asking about video games, people would kind of balk and say, well, does that have to do with reading? But story is so important in so many types of video games. So it's really useful to know all of these different types of entertainment venues and the stories that are being told and the tones that are being used in those formats. I've learned a lot about this in particular by listening to this podcast called Song Exploder. So again, it's not a podcast about books or reading at all. It's about music creation. This is the the creator of the podcast here. So what this podcast is all about, and even if you're not a music fan, I encourage you to seek it out at some point and just listen to the first few minutes of it, and you can see how this works and why it relates to Reader's Advisory. The way this podcast works, they talk to an individual music creator or a band about one piece of music that they have made, and the creator breaks it down. They start and they talking at the beginning of what was the inception of the song. How did they begin the song? Was it a keyword that became an important lyric? Was it a specific bass line? Was it a rhythm that they were hearing? And then they go through the whole process of building the song out, starting with the one element and then adding another element and then adding another instrument, and then maybe they realized that they needed another person's creativity and they brought that in. I learned so much about how many layers are involved in anything by listening to these artists talk about creating their music. And I thought to myself, this has so much to do with books and Reader's Advisory and what's underneath, what's the core of this piece of art, and how has it been built out, and how does that building out impact how we interpret it and how we understand it. So you might find inspiration elsewhere outside of the music realm, but I encourage you to think about other parts of your life where you're hearing people being excited about things, and think about what it is that builds that excitement. And then you can use those same appeals in working with books. You also want to think about what brings a reader to the book. In my book, Serving Teens Through Reader's Advisory, I talk a lot about how teenagers come to books, and it's not much different from how adults come to books. They come to them seeking escapism, connection, reflection, or education. And they're not exclusive. They overlap and they go back and forth, and they're very changeable. And so they're changeable for the reader too. So a book that provides escapism for some reader might be a book that shows connection for another reader. We encounter this a lot right now in the We Need Diverse Books movement for youth in particular, where a book that is affirming and reassuring to a reader in seeing someone of their own background and culture reflected in print provides a doorway to another reader who has been previously maybe unaccustomed to hearing about, reading about, meeting people of that culture and background. And so it's not like this category over here is escapist books and this category over here are connection books. That's very changeable. Even with something like fantasy, someone might find that you might think fantasy is an escapist genre. Well, for some people it might be, but for some other people, that characters struggle to persevere and overcome a difficulty might be something that they relate to a great deal on a personal level. And so if we think about what is it that they're bringing and why are they seeking out this reading experience, this can help inform the types of books that we recommend. So appeal is all about how the reading experience makes the reader feel. How does the book feel to the reader? We can gather a good bit of information, even if we haven't read the books, by perusing the book covers. Thank goodness for fantastic cover artists. It's always so disappointing when you pick up a book that seems like it's going to be one thing and that's very different because the cover art is different from what we would want, how we would depict the book. But we can learn a little bit about how the book feels by looking at the cover art, by reading the flyleaf or the back cover of the book, from browsing through a few pages. And then we can start formulating some keywords that we can use to describe these books. So the book in the middle, The Girl in the Train, just at first glance, it looks like something in motion. A train is mentioned in the title. Yes, this is a fast-paced book. The coloring of the cover indicates that it's a suspense. It's a contemporary novel. We can page through, read a few pages, and fairly quickly learn that the narrator may be hiding something. It may be a slightly unreliable narrator. Excuse me. Similarly, with Once Upon a River, the new Diane Setterfield title, the cover is very different. We are seeing art that's more naturalistic, more more artistic in terms of like a sketching kind of style, and it does mirror the content. It's atmospheric, it's historical, there's a sense of place. The river, again, is mentioned in the title. So these aren't fail-safes. You still have to do a little bit of digging, but you already know a lot about the book that you're picking up just by looking at it, just by paging through it a little bit. Novelist, the database that I swear by, I think a lot of you have access to Novelist as well, has created this fantastic guide. It's all available as a PDF on their website. I'm going to try to switch over and show you the, you can also, I think if you get in touch with them, they will send you a copy of it. It's a lovely little spiral bound deal here, but it goes into the language of appeal, and it's fantastic in terms of helping articulate what are the different types of appeal and how are they used in the Novelist database. So it's great to have these terms, but if our terms are not the same as the terms of the sources that we're using to search for material, it's going to be a little bit less useful. So, for example, I might say it's a complex plot, but Novelist is saying intricately plotted. So it's good to have this little bit of background if you're using a tool like that. Similarly, search in your catalog and really figure out what are the search terms that are being used to describe mysteries, for example, or historical fiction of different eras. This is fantastic. I highly encourage you to take a look at this and spend some time using that, especially if you use the Novelist database. It will make you a much more efficient user of Novelist, which just continues to grow and become more and more rich and useful. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about plot versus appeal. So most of the time when somebody asks about a book, what was that book about? We go straight to plot. So here's a plot-based description of The Hunger Games. It details the adventure of Katniss Everdeen, who is forced to engage in a fight-to-the-death tournament against other children in a dystopian society. So even in that plot-based description, there are appeal elements being used. So adventure tells us a little bit about it. Dystopia tells us about the setting, and there's some other little hints there, but those are the big ones. And it tells you a lot about what the story is about. But if you shift it to an appeal-based description, you get a much richer explanation of what the reading experience is going to be like. So my description of The Hunger Games from an appeal standpoint might be something like this. Full of action, with a cunning and complex main character whose intense loyalty and ingenuity set her apart, The Hunger Games follows young Katniss Everdeen fighting to survive in a suspenseful, high-stakes, Survivor meets Blade Runner-style reality show. So I'm going to point out a few things that I think are important in a description like this. First, we're describing the main character. Who is it that we're reading about? The fact that we're describing the main character at all tells us that this, while it's an adventure, it's also a character-based, a character-driven story. The character and who she is and how she grows is important to the story. We're talking about her characteristics. Do you want somebody who you can really ally yourself as a reader? Or do you prefer figuring them out? Do you want them to be a mystery? In this case, it's she is somebody who we relate to from the very beginning. It's suspenseful. And then also pulling in the Survivor meets Blade Runner style reality show description there talks about pulling in pop culture and other types of cultural reference points into the description, which I think is fantastically useful. If you can describe the book not just in the context of the book world, but pull it out into the world in which we live. So that's a little bit about appeal in a nutshell. I'm going to talk a little bit about Nancy Pearl's 4 doorways concept, her structure for talking about appeal. It's not dissimilar to Joyce's. It's just a different language with which to talk about this. And this might resonate more with some of you. It might resonate more with some of your patrons. Instead of jumping straight to appeal, Nancy has categorized these into doorways. So how are you going to enter a book? The first one is story. This would be for people who read, who are drawn to plot-driven novels, where relating to Katniss as a character wouldn't be so important to them as relating to the story as a fast-paced adventure story. But you might be surprised. So you might think something like the mystery genre would for sure fit in story because it's all about figuring out the mystery. But there are lots of people who prefer to read a specific type of mystery because of the type of character who is central to that story. Story is something that's, if you look in the book, oftentimes the way the pages are laid out that's going to give you a little clue as to what's the story about. A page turner is going to have lots of dialogue like these do, lots of white space. So for people who like a character-driven story, oftentimes the character is right there on the cover. This is another little giveaway for character-based stories. But finding out is the character's name right there in the title, or is their face on the cover of the book? Is the person, and reading about the person and relating to the person, the most important thing about the story? A coming-of-age story is for sure a character-driven story. Setting is another doorway. There are people we've all encountered who will read anything if there's a map on the inside cover, whether it's a realistic map of World War II battlefields or a fantastical map of Middle Earth. Setting really can happen in so many different ways. So here we have a fantasy novel with Game of Thrones. We have two contemporary teen novels, one set in Tokyo, one set in New York City, where, especially with The Sun is Also a Star and My Almost Flawless Tokyo Dream Life, the character, the place really does function like a character. We feel a connection to the place just as much as we might to the character. Where the Crawdads Sing is another newer book that is rich in detail about the natural world in the American South. So visiting another time or place, this is kind of where the escapism might come in for some readers, or you might read it. As I was reading the new Rachel Cohen here, I thought this would be a fantastic book for a teenager who's heading to Japan on some kind of excursion or foreign study, because it reads kind of like a travel log almost. So there's lots of different things here. Language is the fourth doorway. And language is going to be important for people who are interested in reading literary fiction, but it's also important for emerging readers who are seeking something where there's lots of dialogue, maybe something that's a little bit more experimental. So language might evidence itself in fairly dense pages like the one on the right, or it might be something like the one on the left where you can see right off the bat, this is not a typical book. This is not unfolding the way, say, James Patterson unfolds. The language and how the book is crafted are critical to the book itself and enjoying the book. The nice thing about either of these methods, if you're going straight for appeal or if you're looking at doorway, it's about the reading experience and how the book makes you feel. You don't have to remember exactly how the mystery unfolds. You just have to remember how you felt as you were figuring it out. For me, and for I think a lot of us, remembering emotion is a lot easier than remembering the details. I used to be able to remember, just about everything about every book I read and where it was on the shelf and what color the cover was. That knowledge has long been replaced with all the details of My Little Pony and now what my kids' schedules, and who knows what, and all these other books too. So we all have things that we remember very well, but emotions tend to be things that are harder to forget. Oh, I'd like you to pull out, I know we're running a little short on time. Hopefully we have just a few more minutes. I'd like you to pull out that description that you used at the very beginning when you were writing about a book that you've recently read. So this is a template that I created for my first book, and I think it's really useful as you're trying to figure out how to talk about books from an appeal standpoint. You can use this formula with just about any type of book. It's a blank book about blank who blanks. If you like books that blank, you might like this one. People who like blank have also liked this one. So you're getting to genre and tone. you're getting to character. You're talking about plot and character traits, tone, framing, pacing. You can add anything into those middle sections, and including that read-alike, especially if you can include another type of media in that section, is a great way to describe the book based on appeal and cater it specifically to the person in front of you. So here's an example. It's a World War II book about two curious but isolated teens who cling to hope and determination despite war's horrors. If you like books that unfold slowly while the characters are revealed, you might like this one. People who've liked Cutting for Stone have also liked this one. So here is the book. It's all the light we cannot see. That's that one. We can do another one. It's a book with a dual narration about a blind girl and an orphan in World War II who connect via a clandestine radio broadcast. If you like books that have rich settings, puzzles, and well-drawn characters, you might like this one. People who have liked other book club picks, like 5/4 of the Orange, have also liked this one. And it's the same book. And this is why a little cheat sheet like this can be so helpful, because you can describe the same book in so many different ways, and you're not deceiving the patron. You're just pulling out the things from that book that relate to the appeal elements that you think are going to be most important to them, and including that. The plot is, it folds, it's important here, it's part of the description, but it's also about the appeal and how that specific appeal that you're sharing with the patron is going to be relevant to them. So I would encourage you to take a second here and look at the book that you used in your little introductory pop quiz that I gave you, and see if you can reframe your book description into this format. All right. And you can work on that and share it with your colleagues. There's a few more things that I wanted to talk really briefly about. I know we're at time. Hopefully we have just a few more minutes because we started a little bit late. But I wanted to talk about discovery techniques and how important it is to use your tools before you need your tools. It sounds like you guys have a fantastic group where you get together and you share information back and forth. Your colleagues are your best tool. My colleagues will continue to be the most useful, most enriching part of my Reader's Advisory service. And so please do lean on each other and share information as much as you can. But I do encourage you also to seek out other things, like here I have the New York Times book review section. This is where people, these are the books that people know about, and so knowing about what the books people are talking about is so important. That's critical. So figure out where are people hearing about books in your community and know what those books are. The Adult Reading Roundtable is the group. This is really why we have such strong Reader's Advisory in the Chicago area, because we have this group, the Adult Reading Roundtable, and they work on this popular fiction list. The 5th edition is in production right now. I think they're just about finished with it, so keep your eyes peeled for that coming probably by the end of the year. But this is a great self-evaluative bibliography. So what they've done is they've gone through and broken out popular genres and subgenres and figured out who are the authors who are pivotal and most important, most popular, and still alive and writing in those genres. And you can go through and give yourself a little self-check. Do I know this author? Have I read this author? Am I familiar with that person? Do I know what they write about? So you know what gaps you personally have and where you need to fill those in. Novelist, again, I'll mention, is a fantastic tool, and it just continues to become more and more rich with continuing education resources. They have an appeal scavenger hunt, which is a great little tool if you go onto their site in the Reader's Advisory for Librarians section, where you can use that to educate yourself on the different appeal elements and how they're used in Novelist. So when that patron is standing in front of you, you are much more efficient in using that database to find the things that are going to be most useful to your patron. These are my 3 back pocket resources. And you might have different ones. I encourage you to share what yours are with your colleagues. These are the things that I could not live without. Novelist, again, I'll continue to mention Novelist until I'm blue in the face. But also KDL What's Next. KDL is the Kent District Library here in the United States. They have put together a fantastic resource for series. So you can put in any series by author, by title of a single book, or by series title. and it will pull up the series in order. Series continue to be fantastically popular, and I use this every single time that I'm sitting at the desk answering questions. And finally, Goodreads. Like I said before, my memory is not what it used to be, and I need to rely on memory aids. I used to have a notebook that I carried around with me and would jot down the titles that I'd read, but I've moved that to Goodreads because it is everywhere I need to be. It's in my pocket. It's on my desktop. It's right there. And then I can also click over to colleagues of mine who I've connected with on Goodreads, or maybe not even people that I know, but people who seem to continue to read and share about interesting books and get recommendations that way. The invisible college thing about sharing information person to person. The read-alikes that Goodreads offers are pretty good, but I mainly use Goodreads for remembering what I myself have read. These are some of my favorite resources. All of these are linked, and you'll have access to this whole presentation at the end. Some of them are for genres, some of them are general. The Adult Reading Roundtable, again, is the organization that I mentioned before. You can become a member of the Adult Reading Roundtable from anywhere, and they do share some fantastic resources, but you don't necessarily need to be a member of the group in order to benefit from the resources that they create. The popular fiction list that they've created is licensed to Novelist, so you can access that through Novelist. Becky Spratford, who referred me to all of you, she has a fantastic blog. She is a horror expert, so if you have horror fans, her blog is great for that. But she reviews general fiction as well, and talks a lot about the work of Reader's Advisory and how do we do it, and how do we draw on the resources that we have to really create a rich Reader's Advisory experience for our patrons. Library Reads is and Booklist Shelf Care Podcast are professional book review journal products that are created by librarians. Similarly, Shelf Awareness is a great resource that talks about new fiction and what's coming and what's next. The Three Books podcast is put together by a couple public librarians, who one of whom is a good friend of mine. But I think it's really fantastic and wonderful to listen to that podcast to hear how librarians can talk about books. And so over the course of the podcast, they're talking about books from an appeal based perspective, but also they're talking about the other things in their lives, the other things in their patrons' lives that draw them to different books. So that's a fantastic resources. And then there's a few genre ones there. One for romance, Worlds Without End for fantasy, sci-fi, and horror, and Stop You're Killing Me for mysteries. I just love all the mystery titles. They're just so punny. Some tips and tricks for getting, when that person comes up and you're in the middle of working on next year's budget and now you need to think about a great fiction book that has a differently abled character and is set in Barbados and you just can't think of anything. 4 on the floor. This is a technique that was shared with me from another librarian friend of mine who worked at Nordstrom's in the shoe department for a while. This was what they would do whenever somebody would come in and ask for a shoe. They would bring them the shoe that the customer had asked for. They would bring a shoe that was very similar to that shoe. They would bring a shoe that had something similar to it but was a little bit different, and then they'd bring a wild card, something that just kind of spoke to them, something that was different in a way that they thought would excite the customer. And so the person would always have 4 pairs of shoes to choose from, not just the one that they asked for. I think this is so useful in a book context. So if somebody is asking for a book, give them the book they're looking for, or a book similar to the one that you think that they might like, and then give them another one that's similar. And then don't be afraid to stretch a little bit and give them something different, something that hits on maybe one of their appeal elements, but not the other one, but offers something different that they might not have known that they wanted. Memory aids like using Goodreads or jotting notes to yourself, or shelf talkers, or any kind of bookmark where your colleagues are saying, these are my favorite books or favorite mysteries, things like that. Little book lists and cheat sheets like that are fantastic. So use those amply. 3 words and 3 books. This is another strategy from a librarian colleague of mine where every time she reads a book, she comes up with 3 words to describe that book. And it's a really great thing. So when you might not have time to write a full annotation of every book that you read, but when you finish a book, if you jot down 3 words about it, the process of writing it down or keying it in is going to help you remember it. And the process of going through and figuring out what 3 words are the ones that I would use to come back to describe this book. It's a really useful exercise. Merchandising, like using those book lists, putting out shelf talkers, doing displays. If everyone in your department or everyone in your library does this, you're going to soon figure out, oh, this is Susan's favorite book. I know if you like books like the kind that Susan always talks about, you're going to love this book because every time it's here, Susan puts it out on a face-out display. This is a really useful thing, again, using your colleagues in the merchandising context. Micro collections. If you have a little bit of space on your desk, if you have even a spot up at the checkout desk where you can stack 3 books together to create a little micro collection. Maybe you have a little tiny 3 or 4 book collection that relates to a holiday, or a 3 or 4 book collection that has a very atmospheric tone, or something like that, so that you're not devoting a lot of time and energy and space to this one thing, but it's enough that there's a little bit of volume that's going to draw people's attention to it. And if their eye catches on the one thing that maybe they've already read, perhaps they'll like something else that's in that collection. Which takes us to read-alikes. It's so useful to have read-alikes. I've seen some really great examples of librarians doing this with just blatantly, where they'll have the 2 books next to each other with a sign in between that says, if you like this one with an arrow to the left, you might like this one with an arrow to the right. So helping people see how they can move from a book that they've liked to another book and vice versa is really helpful. And finally, sure bets. This is something that when I was working in Joyce Sarix's department earlier on in my career, we lived and died by our sure bets lists. We had a binder at the reference desk, and anytime somebody read a book that they thought would appeal to a variety of people based on a variety of different elements, they would add it to the sure bets list. So sure bet is not a good read. It's not a book club book necessarily, but it's a book that a number of different people would like for a number of different reasons. It's kind of getting back to that Shawshank Redemption thing, where it's so universally broadly appealing that chances are if you put it in front of somebody, they're going to find something in it that appeals to them. Of course, it's not probably not as universal as Shawshank Redemption, but something that's going to appeal to any reader who's looking for X experience or Y type of book. All right, that is the end of my my general presentation. Beyond this, on the slides that you guys are going to have access to, I do have a lot of additional resources, and it looks like I forgot to link those. I'll go through and link those. But lots of different resources that you can use in your Reader's Advisory practice. Newsletters, you just have to figure out how many newsletters your email box can handle and how often you want to get them. I do have a newsletter as well through the through Booklist for the audiobooks section. So if any of you select audiobooks, I would love for you to subscribe to my newsletter. Genre features, genre blogs and resources. Pop culture and trying to figure out what is it that people are being exposed to right now. These are all, American sites. If you go on any of them, it's all about Game of Thrones right now. So that is the thing that's happening around here right now. But knowing about what pop culture resources are useful. And then these are some Reader's Advisory specific resources. These pamphlets here that are pictured, this is a brand new resource that has been created by Joyce Sarix and Neil Wyatt, who they're like the dream team of Reader's Advisory, and they've put together these pamphlets that you can purchase from the American Library Association. They come in bulk packets so that patrons can pick them up. So if they're romance readers, you open the romance one, it's a little single-fold pamphlet that talks a little bit about different types of romances and then gives you a place to begin with various romance authors and the types of books that they read. Everything else there is fairly self-explanatory. that Dear Fahrenheit 451 by Annie Spence is a book that was written by a librarian friend of mine that's not necessarily about Reader's Advisory, but she talks a lot about the books she loves and why she loves them, and a lot of it connects to other parts of her life. And I think it's a really great resource as you're thinking about how can you articulate appeal in a way that feels natural and not forced. And even if you don't read the whole thing, just reading a little bit of it, I think it gives you a sense of her style. And you're going to, as you work through this, as you continue to develop your skills, you're going to develop your own style for dealing with different Reader's Advisory requests as well. And then podcasts. As the audiobook editor, I'm listening to things almost all the time. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and fortunately, we have a lot of fantastic podcasts now out there which talk about books and discussing books and sharing books. Booklist has its own podcast now called Shelf Care. The first episode is out. The second episode is going to be coming out in just a day or two, so you're getting in on the ground floor on that one. And then the 3 Books podcast that I mentioned earlier is down there as well. And then I have my works cited then at the end. So, all right. I'm going to exit out of my screen there so I can see any questions you might have. I'll try to navigate back to that. Okay. Give me a minute here. I'm going to scan back.
So does anyone have questions? For those online, if you could ask them via chat, I will have to relay them because we can't see chat on the room system, much as obviously Heather will be able to see chat. That was brilliant, yes. I'm just going to echo what Catherine Johnson said. That was a really great session, Heather.
Thank you.
To think about.
Yeah, it is a lot.
Yes, but it's great that you're making the resources available. They'll be available via the minutes, and the copy of the recording will also be available via the minutes as well. Yes. So any questions? Or is everyone shell-shocked?
Oh yeah, so Catherine says she really likes the 4 on the floor. I love that technique. It's really great. It's kind of a fun thing to do too. There's a little bit of guessing involved in that. Also, this might sound silly, but the fact that they're on the floor, I think, is something else that we can use. We don't want to put the books on the floor, but especially if you're ever working with a teenager or somebody who is delving into a genre that they might be unfamiliar with, or a type of book, even if it's a nonfiction book or for an informational book request that that might be a little bit more sensitive. If you just put the book down, if you're near a table, or if you can place the book that you're recommending at the end of the shelf, so they're not pressured to physically take it out of your hands, that empowers them to make the choice or decline the choice, which I think is so important.
Yes, that's a nice touch because it's not like you're thrusting them into someone's hands and they can't escape you. You're giving them the choice. And that would work even with suggesting ebooks as well. You're not forcing them into their loans or, enabling a yes or no rather than I've got to take this because otherwise the librarian is going to be rude to me.
Yeah, you don't want to put them in a position where they think they're disappointing you by not taking the book. I also try to really assure people, I won't be offended if you don't like this one. Tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong.
Any questions or comments from here? Okay. Well, please join me with in thanking Heather. I still haven't worked out how you thank through chat thing, other than say thank you, but I've got to work out how applause works through chat. So please join me in thanking Heather now.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Please do reach out. My contact information is on the slides, and I would love to hear from you and hear what strategies you all are using that I might not have thought of, because we can all be colleagues together globally now and just share the knowledge even more broadly. So I will leave the screen then, and you can get on with your meeting.
Thank you so much, but thank you also so much, Heather. That was great.
Yeah, thank you all. Have a great day.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Now, just to let everyone know, I'm going to stop the recording now because while I think it's really helpful to have Heather's recording, I don't know that I think it's probably going to be more intimidating if I keep the recording going. So I'm just going to stop the recording.